The presenter is Dr. Gregg Redner, who is music director at Metropolitan United Church in London, Ontario. He's an assistant professor of music at the University of Western Ontario. He's originally from New York City. Gregg holds 3 degrees from the Juilliard School of Music in organ and harpsichord, and a PhD in modern languages from Exeter University in the United Kingdom. Gregg is a lifelong stamp collector who began collecting worldwide stamps at the age of 8. He became interested in the stamps of Canada in his teens, focusing on Newfoundland. For the past 20 years, Gregg has concentrated on the stamp issues of Belgium, with the focus on the Belgian parcel post stamps, the 1906 Milan exhibition, and the host country stamp issues of the Winter Olympics. He is a member of the RPSC, APS, RPSL, AAPE, Sports Philatelists International, and the Philatelic Specialist Society of Canada. He is a board member of both the RPSC and the SPI. Gregg has exhibited at the national and the international level. And recently I read a very nice article that he wrote in the American, I guess it's called Topical Association. Very nice article. And Gregg's topic tonight is the Brussels Philatelic Exposition Special Printings, Belgium's first Montenez issue. And I give you Gregg.
So thank you everybody for having me tonight. And for a number of you, you've spent a tremendous amount of time with me over the last 3 days. You can think that's worse than hearing me speak once is hearing me speak 3 times. There are an awful lot of you that were here last night, and this will be a completely different presentation. So last night I presented on another stamp in the 1919 to 1921 period of post-World War I Belgian stamps. And the question came up, why do I collect 1919 to 1921? And in truth, I collect that period because people have paid almost no attention to the post-World War I stamps of Belgium. A lot of work has been done on the World War I occupation that took place by the Germans and how that affected postal traffic and the system in Belgium. But most people have ignored the stamps that immediately followed the war. And during that time, there were a very small number of stamps issued as Belgium tried very hard to rebuild what was an absolutely crippled postal system. We'll talk a little bit less about that tonight because this is really the end of that period. The period begins with the first stamp that was issued after the war, which is called the Peron of Liege issue, which is a stunning stamp that was engraved in Belgium. The plates were created in Holland, and it was printed in the UK. After that, things go downhill pretty quickly. The stamp I showed last night truly has to be one of the ugliest stamps that, you know, a country as sophisticated and modern as Belgium was ever produced. So at the end of 1921, with this stamp, this first of the Montenez issues, they really have returned to first-class form. And this is the beginning of modern postal issue printing in Belgium. They had many beautiful stamps in the 19th century, but this is the end of the 1919 to 1921 period. And as such, it marks the kind of recovery of the Belgian postal system. So the stamp that we're going to look at tonight is the stamp that was prepared for the International Philatelic Exposition that took place in Brussels in 1921. And behind here, you'll get to see them a little bit later. Behind here, you'll see the really beautiful Cinderella one of 3 different color combinations that was presented and printed for this issue. It was a great big deal for Belgium to be able to put on this fine an exhibition 2 years after the war. So here we go. This exhibition exhibit took place between May 25th and May 30th, 1921. And it took place in Brussels, and it was housed at the Egmont Palace. Count Egmont is a great hero in 19th century Belgian history. And his family goes way back before that. 18th century. You may know him through a play by Goethe. And the play that Goethe wrote included, in its first performance, music that had been composed by Beethoven, which is a pretty nifty little combination of people to be involved in any theatrical production. So the Egmont Overture is kind of a really famous piece of music. This is the Egmont Palace from the courtyard, and it's a contemporary postcard from the time. Here are the 3 color combinations of the Cinderella, the poster stamp that was created. They're beautiful kind of early 20th century, wonderful kind of graphics, and actually quite special that they went to the added trouble and added expense of having them printed in 2 colors. Gives some sense of the importance of the event to the organizers. Belgium has a long history of producing souvenir sheets, period, but also souvenir sheets for international philatelic exhibits. This stamp we're looking at tonight was the first time that they did it, but almost for every other exhibit that happened until the 1950s, major international exhibits, Belga Post created a commemorative souvenir sheet. And some of them are really incredibly valuable. Just to give you an example, this is from 1935, and it's Francois de Tassis, the Grand Master of what obviously then was not Belgium, but of the Grand Post before 1502. And it's from the 1935 exhibit. Here are 2 additionals. These are from 1930 and 1931. The one on the left is King Albert's son, Leopold, who was a corporal in the 12th Regiment, as it says, and saw some serious service in World War II. The one on the right is one of my favorites from 1930, and it's the Antwerp City crest. And it's just the most beautiful engraving. It's a very small stamp, and the color is just absolutely stunning on it. So the man we're going to be talking about tonight, his name is Georges Montenez, and there are no contemporary photos that anyone can find except for this one, which is kind of a bit later in his life. He was the son of a Belgian schoolmaster, born in 1873 in the province of Hainaut. In 1886, at the age of 13, he was singled out for his artistic talent and enrolled in the Mons Academy, where he studied drawing and engraving. This is a picture of the Mons Academy as it exists today behind the text. At the age of 23, he was awarded a Prix de Rome, which was really quite remarkable in art for someone his age. And he spent a number of years in Italy studying engraving and studying the engravings of the Italian masters. He eventually won further prizes and academic prizes in Paris, Lille, and Athens. This is an example of some early work. He was only in his early 20s when he did this engraving. And it shows tremendous promise, I think, and is beautifully detailed. Slightly later, no indication of who this person in the engraving is, but it's, again, a really spectacular engraving. And then this one, which is of a French writer, but I can't find out who it is. And I was showing this to my stepdaughter the other night, and she said, "Are you sure that's not a photograph?" It's such a fine engraving and very beautiful. And his pieces today come up on auction occasionally, and while he is far from famous, they do command a reasonably decent price, justifiably so, I think. He did produce one postcard in his life. This postcard was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the consecration of the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Belgium, and it was a religious building that played a tremendous role in the World War I climate of Belgium, and along with the cathedral in Mechelen, where the famous Archbishop, whose name escapes me now, was, this building was really a quiet example of resistance to the German occupation. And it's a stunning building, just absolutely monstrous. So that card is a beautiful kind of remembrance, I think, not only of the beauty of the building and the date, but also of its importance in 1918 to the people of Belgium. So Montenez produced only 3 stamp issues for the Belgian government, and they're commonly known as the Petit Montenez, stamps which our stamp comes from is the first, and they existed in public use from 1921 to 1948. The question came up last night, why the end date? And it's because all Belgian stamps are demonetized. So at a certain point, they're no longer able to be used. And of course, that's foreign to us here in Canada, but that's their custom and continues to be. The second issue is the Grand Montenez issue, which is a much larger frame stamp and a slightly different engraving of the king. And then the Two Kings issue, which celebrates the 75th anniversary of the first postage stamp in Belgium. And those were in use from 1925 to 36. Here's the Two Kings issue. This depicts King Leopold I on the left and King Albert, who was then the current king at the time of the issue. This Leopold is not the evil Leopold who created such horrible atrocities in the Congo. This is his, I believe it's his father. I'm pretty sure it's his father. And he was a pretty decent person. And a very good king, and industrialized Belgium really quickly after they became an independent country and developed the rail system, and was quite a person. And King Albert, who you may not know a lot about, was the most popular king in Belgian history, famed for his tremendous intellect. He was a great military leader. When the Germans wanted to invade, or not invade, pass through Belgium to attack the French from the north, he historically, at the beginning of World War I, he historically said to them, "I govern a nation and not a road." The answer is no. And then the Germans invaded Belgium and occupied it, and basically punished the Belgian people for this for the next 4 years. This is a stamp. This is the stamp series known as the Grand Montenez, and you'll notice it's reasonably similar to the stamp that we're going to be looking at. There's some differences, but it's a larger frame and a larger stamp. This is the Souvenir Sheet that was released in 1924 for the next international postal philatelic exhibition in Brussels. And so it's slightly different than the one we're going to be looking at tonight, but bears all of the kind of hallmarks that we'll see in the 1921. So the Petit Montenez issue is a series of higher value stamps, starting with the 50 centime stamp that you see on the left, and going all the way up to 10 francs. the 50 centime and 75 centime that you see at the bottom in the center were re-engravings and plate adjustments and reprintings of these two at the top, which were which wore out. The 50 centime in the bottom right is the stamp we're concerned with tonight. That was the one released for the special printing. For those of you that don't collect Belgium and don't know, the Catalogue Officiel de Belgium is the Scott catalog, our Canadian version of that. It's the official catalog and the one with the most information in it, and most Belgian collectors identify their stamps by Cobb numbers. So this is Cobb 187 in the order of releases. And I just think it's such a stunningly beautiful stamp. The quality of the engraving is very beautiful. It was not customary to a great extent for the engraver to include his name at the bottom of the stamp, and it shows you what great pride he had in this issue, and also how proud the Belgian Postal Authority was of this issue. They worked very hard to get him to do a stamp series for them. So next to the epaulette and medallion issues, which are the first two issues of Belgium, the Petit Montenez stamps are considered by most philatelists to be the most beautiful of Belgium issues. Certainly one of them. I think they really are the most beautiful. They were created by Royal Decree May 17, 1921, and Ministerial Decree May 18, 1921. And all this means is the king approved of the engraved image and the final proof. And then because he approved of it, the ministry also approved of it being released. The stamp was released in the special printing we're looking at tonight on May 26, 1921, which was the first day of the Philatelic Exposition. It features a very finely engraved profile of King Albert I, circular white frame, surrounded by a wreath of laurel and oak leaves, and the country name is inscribed bilingually in Flemish and French, with French always at the top on Belgian stamps. This was not always the case, and it wasn't until the late part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century that what was a purely French language stamp vocabulary was eventually made bilingual. Interestingly, last night we were saying that after King Albert reoccupied the city of Brussels as the capital at the end of World War I, he put in a bunch of sweeping social and political changes to the country, one of which was to really dignify the existence of the Flemish language and give it a place of equal importance to French, which it had not really had up until this point. The printing work was prepared and executed by Johann and Schede and Sons of Haarlem. The reason for this is the Germans had used the Belgian national printing works as a stable and a storehouse, and had destroyed all of the equipment in it during the occupation. So most of the stamps that are printed in the first 3 years after the restoration of the Belgian government are printed outside of the country. And Johann and Schede and Sons actually did a lot of work for the Belgian government before the war, and they are really high-end company. They've been in existence since 1703, and you can see they executed work in letterpress, photogravure, offset, steel plate printing, photo engraving, and type founding. There are no proofs available for this issue. There is one proof that exists in a private collection, which the Gruben catalog, which is the Belgian version of the prints of the die proofs and essays. It's the catalog where you can find the most information. They identify a 15 centime black printed proof for this issue. And it's dated 12 July 1920, and it's signed by Montenez and labeled as being in Paris, which Gruben believed indicated that the stamp had been, the proof had been printed in Paris. I don't think so. There's no reason they would have printed it in Paris. I think he was probably in Paris at the time and just simply dated the stamp. But there's no essays or proofs or any original artwork for this 50 centime stamp. Production numbers were pretty small for this. They produced 10,000 souvenir sheets of this particular stamp with a yield of 250,000 stamps. That's the outside, that's the top number. You can find this stamp in two different sizes. It's unimportant, you can read the sizes here. One is slightly taller than the other. And for a long time, Belgian philatelists believed that there must have been a separate set of plates for this. But there wasn't. People think that it was clear now that because it was wet printed, that you of course know, because you're all specialists in philatelic language, that depending on the grain of the stamp will swell when it's wet for wet printings. And they now believe that the differences in the size lie not in the plates, but rather in the grain and the wet printing. Yeah, so we've covered that. We don't need to talk about that. So due to the wet printing technique, it was necessary for them to use line perforating for this stamp. And unlike the stamp that we looked at last night, where there are some varieties in the perforating of the issue, this one is consistently 11.5 by 11.5 across. It's interesting, actually, and Shede actually was very fond of comb printing, and the comb moving from the top of the stamp to the bottom, but they weren't able to use it here, and so this is not a conventional, the line perforating is not very conventional for them, so it makes this kind of an interesting stamp. There are a lot of nuances of color for this particular issue, and obviously the one on the left is the darkest one. The one in the middle is the standard issue. The one on the right is kind of somewhere between the first two, but there are a lot of other nuances of color. These are kind of the standard. And it would appear, again, not as a surprise to you, that the difference in color really is due largely to the fact of the amount of ink that was placed on the plate. But also because the stamp was printed in the early spring, and some people have suggested that it was a rather high humidity time of year, and that may have affected the color as well, which of course would make sense. This is an entry ticket to the Philatelic exposition. There are only 8 of these known. All of these things come from my collection, so I'm really happy to have this. There are only 8 of these known, which actually have the stamp and the cancel on the ticket. What's interesting is the actual exposition took place from the 25th until the 30th, so I've never really been able to work out why the ticket says 26th to the 29th. It's just a bit of a conundrum. This is the souvenir sheet that we're talking about, and we'll break it down a bit, but you can see that it was printed 25 stamps, 5 by 5. All the printing of these Petit Montenez issues, and some of the early printings were in 25 stamp blocks. They weren't just it wasn't just for this particular printing. One of the reasons for this, a lot of the post-war Belgian stamps, the early parts of each issue in those stamps were printed in 25 stamp blocks, largely because there was still a shortage of paper. And it was very hard to come up with sheets of paper consistently enough to do a big printing run of stamps on sheets of 100 or 150. And so a lot of them you'll find in 25 or 50 sheets. But all of them, regardless of the size, were laid down in blocks of 25. Which makes this really interesting because as we'll see in a little bit, the subsequent 50 centime stamps that were printed, the gray issue that was printed at the top of that block of Petit Montenez that we were looking at, and the ones that were re-engraved were all taken from the original block that this 50 centime indigo souvenir sheet stamp was taken from. So there are a lot of wonderful opportunities to see how the plates developed later on. For this particular issue, there were 6 plates created. They used plate 1 to 4 and plate 6. Early philatelists from Europe suggested, well, they must have kept plate 5 in reserve, but that doesn't make any sense to me. Why you would keep plate 5 and skip to plate 6, I can't conceive of the reason for that. So I think what happened is plate 5 was damaged. There's no record of anybody ever having seen plate 5. So 1 to 4 and 6 were the plates that were used for this. There are a small number of imperforate sheets. The largest number I've ever heard was 10. And other people suggest that there were only 8 or 9, like usual. They were given to dignitaries and important people. The largest number, multiple of imperforate stamps known today is 2. There are no complete sheets left, imperforate sheets. Here's the Philatelic Exposition cancel. You can see it's bilingual, as we would expect it to be. They were still on a 24-hour clock at this point. And so this is the time, day, month, and year at the bottom. All Belgian stamps up until the late 1940s, and 1 or 2 exceptions in the early 1950s, are marked with what's called a depot mark. And these are collected and are very interesting because there are a tremendous variety of them, usually. This particular issue has just this one depot issue, the same exact depot mark for 1920 and 1921. There are 1 or 2 that exist, souvenir sheets that exist with the depot mark 1920. I can't really understand why they would have put 1920 on these, and I think it must have been a mistake. It's very unusual when they switch depot marks that they would just simply change the numbers. They switched the depot marks to prevent any kind of counterfeiting. And these were used to mark the sheet so that when it went into the treasury, they knew that the sheet had been accounted for in the registry and that it had been accounted for when it was placed in the treasury. So they always had an accurate idea of how many stamps and sheets they had. Plate numbers appear at the bottom of each sheet of 25 on stamp number, under stamp number 23 in the middle. And this is simply a control mark to show that the final supervisor has seen that it's been appropriately produced, it's good for sale, and it was marked into the registry. Occasionally you'll see this as a double C. I'm not really sure why that was the case, but the C is simply a control mark, and it appears on all Belgian stamps into the 30s. This is a unique addition. This is at the bottom of the sheet that I showed you early on. And of course at the top it has the cancel from the 1921 exhibition and exposition as you would expect. But this person took it back to get it canceled at the 1924 one as well. And I love the fact that there's the fingerprint of the person who was working in the printing house at the time. Now, there are plate varieties, constant plate varieties in this issue, and they're quite interesting, I think. And these continue on, as we were saying, through all of the working plates for all the subsequent printings of the different 50 centime stamps. So it doesn't really matter if it was 25, 50, 100, or 150 stamps on a sheet. This block of 25 exists on all, is the foundation of all the subsequent printings, so it can be found on everything. So variety 1, and I did this for a couple of friends prior to doing it for you tonight and for my family, and they did not find this particularly thrilling at all. I know you will, and so I'm grateful for the fact that I don't have to point out that the actual variety on this is not my poor red arrow up here. So variety 1, the third stamp in every horizontal row of 5, has a very minute color spot in the middle of the king's forehead. Variety 2, the fifth stamp in every sheet has a colored spot on the king's nose. Again, it's very small. Variety 3, in the Belgium tablet at the bottom, there's a blotch of color in the upper right-hand corner. Variety 4, under the U in Belgique, there's a bit of color in the king's hair. So variety 5, the 13th stamp in every sheet, has a minute spot of color, which you can see at the base of the arrow here. Between the letters G and I in Belgium, it's very small, but it's distinctive and consistent on this particular variety as well. Now, variety 6, a short diagonal line of color in the white circle surrounding the portrait. It's hard to see on this, but we'll zoom in just a second on it. It's always found on the third vertical column of a sheet, but weirdly, never on the 23rd stamp. So you can see there's no need to go through these in great detail, but you can see that the 23rd stamp would be missing in this pattern. So if we take a look, here is variety 6 on the right-hand side. Again, a small, just above the oak leaf cluster, a small bit of color that's consistent. Now, this flaw, variety 7, was identified by Willy Ballas and is known as the Ballas variety, or the B flaw, not because of Ballas, but because of the letter that it occurs on. And it's seen, the beginnings of it can be seen on this particular stamp, but they are much more dramatically seen on the subsequent printing that wasn't done for the souvenir sheet, which is Cobb 211. And it's a small fracture at the base of the B in Belgique at the top. It can be found on the 6th stamp of some sheets from plates 2 and 6. And it should be noted that not every sheet from these two plates shows signs of it at first, but there seemed to have been a gradual weakening of the plate. And since the plate was used also to print the subsequent grayer variety, 211, it carries on into the printing of that as well. Here's an example of it reasonably early, I would say, in that it's not particularly dramatic. But if we go on and take a look at these, you can see how gradually, little by little, it becomes quite prominent, and it expands through the history of the stamp till eventually it was retouched and repaired. All right, so those are the variations. So now we'll move on to the cancellations that exist not on the Montenez stamps, but on some other unusual stamps that it's quite unexpectedly. Strangely, these can be found on some of the Belgian Congo stamps. And there's a collector that has a nice exhibit built around these. They're not as uncommon as you would think, but they're unusual in that Belgian Congo stamps obviously had no practical use in Belgium. So these would have been brought and canceled to the actual event. On the right here, we see Belgian Congo 61 and 89A, the overprint, and 90A from 1921. The 1921 makes sense to me because of the date of the actual the philatelic exhibit. But the 61, which is a 1910 stamp from the Moles and Van Egland series, clearly this was a favor cancel on the on this particular stamp, but nonetheless interesting, I think. Of course, as you would expect, there are a good number of philatelic usages that come from the various days of the exhibit. Here's an example, a local usage to Schaerbeek, which is a just outside of Brussels. What's interesting about this one is to notice the Brussels Exposition registration stamp, and of course this is registration label 735. Just quickly, one little aside, because people ask me about this all the time. What is the little circle with the number in it? And these are postmen's handling numbers. And so when this was given in the post office to be delivered by a specific postman, they were required to put their stamp on it to show that they had handled it. So that has nothing to do whatsoever with the exhibit, but they're very interesting. And to date, nobody has done a study of these. So I think if you're looking for an interesting and kind of wide-ranging exhibit or research, it might be an interesting thing to do. Here's a registered imprimé cover to Leuven, Belgium. And again, much earlier registration stamp. Here's an expedited cover to Lille, France. It's correctly franked at the 1 franc charge for expedited mail. A cover again to Haarlem, Holland, not an express cover this time, correctly franked at 50 centimes. A registered cover to Germany, again, 50 centimes for registration, 50 centimes for international posting, so correctly marked at 1 franc for that. Here's a registered cover to Amsterdam. It's correctly franked using 2 10 centime and 2 15 centime King Albert issues and 1 Cobb 187 registered as well. I particularly like this cover because the King Albert issues were the first stamps issued by the Belgian government in exile. Once they demonetized the 1912 Pellens issue after the Germans occupied Belgium at the beginning of World War I. And I like this cover specifically because these are the 2 first stamps in that series that were issued. And as we mentioned earlier, I see this Montenez Philatelic Exhibit 50 centime stamp we're considering tonight to be the end of the kind of post-World War I recovery period. And so this is kind of an alpha and a mega type cover to me, which I find particularly appealing. Now here's a postally used cover without the actual, obviously because it's 9 years later, without the actual philatelic exhibit cancel on it. These are very hard to find. Excuse me. Most of these stamps were kept either in their original state as souvenir sheets, or would have been, if they were broken up, would have been used reasonably quickly. And so it's not easy to find these on in a non-philatelic cover. And this is a particularly nice one, I think. This also includes the Dendermonde issue. The Dendermonde Town Hall issue was the final issue of the 4 city stamps commemorating cities that had been devastated particularly brutally by the Germans during World War I as they were sweeping across the country and occupying it. This is a very interesting stamp in that the 65 centime sheet, of which both of these stamps would have originally been part of, was actually had a postal usage for a reasonably short period of time. But then the 55 centime charge came to for airmail. And so they rather than create a new stamp to justify the airmail cost, they simply printed alternate rows of the Dendermonde stamp sheets, surcharging or overprinting every other issue at 55 centimes, which allowed these 2 stamps to be used to frank postage and the new charge. So it's a very creative way to get around producing a new stamp and also use up a stamp that had been printed in reasonably large volume. If you're going to collect these, this overprint, it's always good to collect it with the 65 centime next to it. This is a very late registered usage on a covered Hasselt. What I find very interesting about this is an imperfect version of our stamp. And it's very unusual to me to think, I can't understand why this would have been used here, especially in combination with this. There's no actual, I can't think of any justification for using it except that it may have been a stamp that was just laying around and somebody didn't realize that it was an imperf and that it had additional value. A few of them were produced. So I find this imperf actually, it makes quite an interesting cover to have an imperf on a late cover like this that's actually postally used. And this is the 5 franc Kokelberg Abbey from 1938. This cover is actually overfranked by 1 franc and 50 centimes. So again, it's a bit of a mystery to me, and I've never really been able to figure out exactly why they did what they did. But interesting nonetheless. Here's a registered cover to Lille. It was sent during the International Philatelic Exhibit, and it was taxed for insufficient postage upon arrival in France. What's interesting is that this actually covers the cost of this shipment of the stamp, of this use of the stamp. So it has been suggested to me that the tax may have been because of the post restant charge that appears at the bottom here. They may not have provided the actual sufficient postage for that, and that would explain it. Because otherwise, if you look at these two, they are very clearly cover the cost of what we're doing. So I think that's what's happening here. So with the release of the complete Petit Montenez series on September 1st, 1922, the philatelic exhibition stamp was replaced by the grayish blue 50 centime Cobb 211. And this series stayed in use for almost 26 years, and was kind of the workhorse of the period right through World War II. There are a few additional things which I have in my collection of this stamp, which are actually quite rare. This is the only lower margin imperforate of this stamp which is known. And I particularly like it because it's very clearly not a trimmed version. This would pretty much discount that as well. But it's very special that it comes from the bottom row, and it's the only one known. This is the only known partial imperforate with a philatelic exhibit cancel on it. Again, very interesting. I don't know of any sheets where this is the case. Clearly it would have existed because this row would not have been perforated. But this is the only known remnant of that incorrectly perforated sheet. And then last of all, not a lot of tremendous monetary value, but I am very happy to own a copy of two of the 50 centime stamps with the philatelic cancellation on a fragment that was signed by the engraver, Georges Montenez, in Brussels in the year of the stamp's production. I wish it had a month and a year on it. It doesn't, but I like to think he may have even appeared at the exhibit, although I don't know that for certain. This signature has been verified as his by handwriting experts, so very nice to have. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And it's a fascinating period, and I'm really glad to have been able to share something with you about it.